The sound of the metal gate, slamming shut, was like thunder in my ears. I had never imagined myself in a place like this. Concrete walls that seemed to stretch endlessly, cold air thick with sweat and despair. It all began with that stupid fight. An argument with some street kids turned into a full-blown brawl. They got bruised. I got handcuffed. The prison at 920 Sycamore Avenue wasn't just a place for criminals. It was a cage for souls. Every step I took down the dim-lit corridor felt heavier, every shadow hiding some unspoken terror. My cellmate wasn't much for conversation, but the other guy across the hall was something else entirely. He had a face that was hard to forget, scars that twisted his features into something almost inhuman. Every time I looked up, he was staring at me, his lips slightly parted, as if on the verge of growling. At first I thought it was my imagination, the stress playing tricks. But he was always there, always watching. Days passed in a blur of monotonous routines, meals that tasted like cardboard, the endless drone of prison life. I tried to avoid his gaze, focusing on counting cracks in the walls, but I could feel him. His presence wasn't just across the hall. It pressed against me, suffocating. The guards didn't seem to notice him. Maybe they had grown used to his intense demeanor, but for me, it was impossible to ignore. One night, as I lay on the thin mattress, I heard shuffling outside my cell. I froze. His face appeared at the bars, pale in the moonlight. "Why do you keep looking at me?" I managed to stammer. He didn't answer. Instead, he just stood there, staring. And then he smiled. It wasn't a friendly smile. It was a predator's grin, one that made every muscle in my body tense. I spent the rest of the night sitting up, my back pressed to the wall, trying not to blink. The next day, I tried to speak to the guards about him. "The guy across from me," I said, my voice shaking. I don't know. Something's wrong with him." The guard raised an eyebrow. "Which one?" "Cell 47. I nodded. The guard laughed, a short, dry chuckle. "That guy. Don't worry about him, he's harmless. Just keep to yourself." Harmless. Right. That night, I barely slept. Around midnight, I heard the faint creak of my cell door. I sat bolt upright. It was him. And as far as I know, he wasn't alone. He was with some kind of unnatural shadow that I can't even describe. He stood in the doorway, his hulking frame blocking the dim corridor light. My pulse raced as he stepped inside with that shadow thing. Before I could scream, he lunged at me. His hands were like iron, gripping my neck as I thrashed against him. I kicked and clawed, the air leaving my lungs. His scarred face hovered inches from mine, and for the first time I saw something behind the rage, pain, deep and raw. But that didn't stop him. I thought it was over. My vision blurred. Suddenly the lights flickered on and a guard's whistle pierced the air. He let go and stepped back, his eyes narrowing as the guards rushed in. They tackled him to the ground, dragging him away as he screamed obscenities, his voice echoing through the halls. For days, I didn't see him. When I finally asked another inmate what had happened, they told me he'd been moved to solitary confinement. "Lucky you," they said. "He's done worse to others, because he spent his life doing cult and black magic." I should have felt relieved, but I didn't. His eyes haunted me, even after I was released months later. I can still feel them, burning into me whenever I close my eyes. The idea had seemed harmless at first. My friend and I were just bored, scrolling through random forums late one night, when he said, "Do you know how much these rich guys make in a day? What if we skimmed just a little?" I should have laughed it off. I should have said no, but instead, I said, "Let's try it." It started with small accounts, petty scams that went unnoticed. But greed has a way of clouding judgment. Before long, we hacked into the accounts of some big names, siphoning money from millionaires who'd probably never even notice it was gone. We thought we were untouchable. We were wrong. The knock on the door came early one morning, loud and unrelenting. Police. I barely had time to breathe before they cuffed me, dragging me out while my friend yelled in protest. We were charged with cybercrime and financial theft, and the court wasted no time. 4 months in the county jail, the judge said, his gavel coming down like a thunderclap. Maybe you'll think twice next time. The jail was on Pinewood Drive, a grim gray fortress surrounded by barbed wire. It wasn't as bad as the stories I'd heard, but it wasn't good either. The cells were cramped, the food was barely edible, and the days stretched endlessly. My friend and I were placed in the same cell, which was some small comfort. At least we weren't alone. The first day was uneventful. We kept to ourselves, watching the other inmates and trying to avoid trouble. Around noon, a man approached us in the yard. He was older, maybe in his late 40s, with kind eyes and a warm smile. "First-timers?" he asked. We nodded, unsure of what to say. "Don't worry," he said, sitting beside us. "It's tough at first, but you'll get through it. Name's Robert." He told us about life in the prison, the guards to avoid, the inmates who'd leave you alone if you didn't bother them. He even shared some of his food with us, a rare kindness in a place like this. By the end of the day, we were laughing at his stories, feeling a little less like outsiders. That night, as we lay in our bunks, my friend whispered, "Robert's a good guy, huh? Makes this place seem less awful." I agreed. For the first time, I felt like maybe we could get through this. The next morning, we woke up expecting to see Robert in the yard, but he wasn't there. We looked for him at lunch in the common area, even during roll call, but he was nowhere to be found. By evening, I started to worry. "Maybe he got transferred," I said, but something didn't sit right. That night, I asked one of the guards about him. "Robert," the guard repeated, frowning. "What's his last name?" I realized I didn't know. I don't think he told us. He's in his 40s, grayish hair, kind of short. The guard stared at me for a long moment before shaking his head. "There's no one like that here." I blinked, confused. "What do you mean? We talked to him all day yesterday. He even sat with us at lunch." The guard's expression darkened. "You must be mistaken. No one named Robert has been here for weeks." "Weeks?" My stomach twisted. "Are you sure?" The guard nodded. "Positive. Maybe you met someone else and got the name wrong." My friend and I exchanged uneasy glances but didn't say anything. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about Robert, his kind smile, the way he seemed to know everything about the prison. Something about it felt off. And then there were his stories. He'd told us about life on the outside, about how he'd ended up in jail, but none of it added up. He'd never mentioned a specific crime, a trial, or a sentence. The next morning, I pressed another inmate for information. "Robert," I said. "Older guy, gray hair, friendly. You must have seen him." The inmate frowned. "Robert? You mean the guy who used to be in cell block C?" My heart leapt. "Yeah, that's him." The man's face grew serious. "He's dead. Killed himself in the yard about a month ago. Why are you asking about him?" My blood ran cold. That can't be right. We just talked to him 2 days ago." The inmate shook his head. "Not possible. He's been gone for weeks." I stumbled away, my head spinning. My friend caught up to me, his face pale. "Did you hear that?" he whispered. "They're saying he's dead." We spent the rest of the day in silence, too shaken to talk. That night, I dreamed about Robert. He was sitting in the yard, smiling at me, but his eyes were empty, hollow. "You'll be fine," he said, his voice echoing. "You'll get through it." When I woke up, I felt like I couldn't breathe. I stayed awake until morning, staring at the ceiling, trying to make sense of it all. The guards never brought him up again, and neither did the other inmates. It was as if he'd never existed. When my sentence was over, I left that prison behind, vowing never to come back. But even now I think about Robert. Was he just a figment of my imagination, a coping mechanism in a place designed to break you? Or was he something else? Someone who couldn't leave, even in death? I don't have the answers, but sometimes when I'm alone, I swear I can still hear his voice. "You'll be fine. You'll get through it." The party was a blur of lights and laughter, the kind of night where reality seemed to melt away with every glass of wine. By the time I slid behind the wheel, my head was heavy, and the road ahead felt like a winding dream. I didn't think about the consequences. I didn't think at all. Until the crash. The sound of metal twisting and glass shattering jolted me awake in the worst way possible. The taxi I hit spun into a street lamp, the driver climbing out with a bloodied face. My heart sank when the police arrived. They asked for my license, my insurance. I had neither. My wallet was empty, and before I knew it, I was in handcuffs. The judge didn't hold back. "Drunk driving and reckless endangerment," he said sternly. "You're lucky no one died. Let's hope you'll think harder before doing that disgusting thing again." He sentenced me to 3 months in the county jail. That looked more like a relic of despair than a correctional facility. When the van pulled up to the gates, I felt a pit in my stomach. The barbed wire glinted under the floodlights, and the walls loomed like silent giants. Inside, the air was thick with tension and stale sweat. I tried to keep my head down as they processed me. Fingerprints, photos, paperwork. Then came the part I dreaded most. The clanging of the cell door shutting behind me was like a nail sealing my coffin. My cellmate was a heavy-set man with a loud snore and a permanent scowl. He barely said a word, but I didn't mind. I wasn't looking for conversation. That first night, I lay on the thin mattress, staring at the cracked ceiling, trying to ignore the faint murmurs from the other cells. Sleep didn't come easily. Around midnight, I heard whispers. At first I thought they were just echoes of distant conversations, carried through the halls by the ventilation system, but the whispers didn't sound like any language I knew. They weren't words, just fragments, sharp, guttural, and unsettling. I closed my eyes tighter, pulling the blanket over my head, but the sound seemed to grow louder, closer. My heartbeat quickened as I realized the whispers weren't coming from the hallway. They were coming from the bathroom down the corridor. I tried to convince myself it was nothing. Maybe the pipes were old, or maybe my mind was playing tricks on me. But curiosity and a nagging sense of unease eventually got the better of me. I slipped out of bed, careful not to wake my cellmate, and stepped into the corridor. The dim light cast long shadows on the walls, and the air felt colder the closer I got to the bathroom. The door was heavy, the hinges squealing as I pushed it open. Inside, the bathroom was as grim as I'd imagined. Cracked tiles, rusted fixtures, and the faint stench of mildew. A single flickering bulb cast an uneven glow over the room, creating a series of distorted shadows that danced across the walls. I walked to the sink, splashed cold water on my face, and tried to shake off the growing unease. That's when I noticed it. The mirror. At first glance, it seemed normal, but as I leaned closer, my reflection began to shift. My face twisted, distorted, as if the glass were bending reality itself. I blinked and rubbed my eyes, but the image remained. My reflection wasn't mine anymore. It was a man in a police uniform, his face pale and lifeless. His eyes were hollow, staring straight at me. I stumbled back, nearly slipping on the wet floor. He didn't move, but his lips parted, and I heard it, clear as day. "Why did you let me die?" The words echoed in the small room, bouncing off the tiles and burrowing into my skull. My breath hitched, and I froze, unable to look away. His face remained in the mirror, his gaze unrelenting. "Why did you let me die?" he repeated louder this time. "I don't know you," I shouted, my voice cracking. Suddenly the mirror cracked, a spiderweb of fractures spreading across the glass. The light above me flickered violently, plunging the room into brief moments of darkness. When the light stabilized, the mirror was empty again, just a broken piece of glass reflecting my own terrified face. I bolted out of the bathroom, my heart pounding in my chest. The whispers followed me, growing louder as I ran down the corridor. By the time I reached my cell, I was drenched in sweat. My cellmate stirred but didn't wake, his snores drowning out the sound of my ragged breathing. The next morning, I forced myself to ask one of the guards about the bathroom. "Something happened last night," I began, trying to sound casual. The guard raised an eyebrow. "What are you talking about?" "In the bathroom," I said hesitantly. "I saw someone, a man in a police uniform." The guard's expression darkened. "That's not funny," he said sharply. "I'm not joking," I insisted. "Who was he?" The guard sighed, lowering his voice. "A few years back, a cop who worked here was caught taking bribes. When Internal Affairs got involved, he panicked, came into work one night, went to that very bathroom and hanged himself from the pipes. Ever since, people have said the place is haunted. Some inmates refuse to go in there. Others claim they've seen him." I swallowed hard. "And you believe that?" The guard shrugged. "I've never seen anything myself, but the stories have been around long before you showed up." I didn't tell him what I saw. I didn't want to sound crazy. But the image of the man's face haunted me for the rest of my sentence. Every night, the whispers came back, louder and closer. I started avoiding the bathroom altogether, holding it in until morning if I had to. On my last night in the jail, I woke up to a familiar sound, the door to the bathroom creaking open. I didn't move, didn't breathe, as the whispers filled the air. This time, they weren't distant. They were right outside my cell. I turned over slowly, my heart racing. Standing in the dim corridor was the man in the uniform, his hollow eyes fixed on mine. His mouth opened, but instead of words, all I heard was a long, guttural scream. The lights flickered, and when they came back, he was gone. The next morning, I walked out of that jail a free man, but I've never felt free. The whispers still follow me, in quiet rooms and dark corners, and every time I look in a mirror, I can't help but wonder if I'll see him again.